One of the things that we discussed, we were talking a little bit about posture, and I think it's worth to first create a fork in the road for those listening and have an honest conversation with themselves and be like, what is my interaction with gravity? Like, what is my relative strength to body weight ratio? That'll first determine where these conversations go and how to really choose exercises effective for you.
Why?
So the external environment is a variable that we don't really consider a lot of times. It comes back to this physical empathy thing, right? So you and I, we have a different relationship with gravity. Someone who might not train, someone who might be overweight, looking to sort of start a weight loss or a fitness or a weightlifting resistance training journey. If they aren't honest about their relationship with gravity, some exercises are far out of reach, and that we often prescribe them without thinking about that relationship, without approaching them with that empathy, right? So things like lunges, that's a really difficult exercise for someone who doesn't have a favorable strength to body weight ratio, right? Like, if say someone who's been resistance training for a long time can squat 2 times their own body weight, right? Have a bar on their back, squat down, sort of butt to the heels and back up. A lunge to that person is very different, right? It's like us walking on the moon, right? Like, it's with the strength they have relative to their body weight, a body weight lunge is different, but the body weight exercise and how often that's just mass prescribed to people at home workouts, that's someone could be weaker. A close friend of mine coined this term, Kyle Baxter, brilliant. Some people are weaker than the forces of gravity acting on them, right? So if I woke up every morning and my strength was met with my absolute load. So like for me, if I'm squatting 700 pounds and then when I wake up every morning and I have 700 pounds on my back, and when I go to the grocery store, I have 700 pounds on my back, I'm going to start to adopt a posture that's responsive to this interaction with gravity, right? This gravity, the combined center of mass of this bar on my back. So I think it's really worth, if you guys are listening to this and you're trying to create a workout plan, it's like, I need to understand my relationship with gravity first. And, it's a gradient, obviously, but you can kind of, in this context, we'll bucket it into weaker than the forces of gravity. You're new to training, because the way you should look at the gym is almost like a chessboard, right? So a chess and a checkers board are the same board, right? What's different? The pieces, right? So when we look at the gym, it's the same equipment, but the pieces, the people in there are different, and how we move the different people depends on, what type of piece. So if you're a novice to the gym, your focus might want to be at the very first using more machine-based exercises.
Pat Davidson.
Right.
High ground training.
Yeah. I will use the word stability as the English language suggests, as that is the proper word to use.
But it's interesting because but guys that are very respected in this space also respect you and Pat Davidson. So I mean, it's got to be onto something.
Yeah, it's we're all pointing at the same thing, right?
Yeah.
He's standing on one side calling a 6. I'm standing on the other side calling it a 9. But I think it's really useful in understanding the principle of like what we're trying to do is we're trying to, and this is really easy, and I like the analogy because we start off and everyone is, not everyone, but those who are on the less favorable side of the strength to body weight ratio, who have a different relationship with gravity, they're like a checkers piece. And what do you do with checkers? You make little jumps, right? There's no intricate L shapes and castles that do things and horses that do things. But when you make those jumps across the board, which means, get a couple of exercises that, as Pat would say, I believe you would say high ground. I would say highly externally stabilized, have a broad base of support. We're going to sort of...
And just for you guys who don't know what that is or haven't listened to the podcast with Pat Davidson or the podcast that you did with Pat in your own pod, it's basically a lot of contact. So one is very stable.
Yeah, broad base of support. So stability as a concept in training is ever present. It's what is our center of mass and what is our base of support. So for those who, again, less favorable side of the strength to body weight ratio, just getting started, we want to find movements that have more of that external stability. Broad base support, a leg press would be a great example, because a leg press we can titrate down to below our strength of our body weight.
Yeah, it's interesting because people usually start with body weight exercises,
Crazy.
And some people have weigh a lot more than the 10-pound leg extension that someone would do. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. And that's a really stark contrast to see the difference. Like, that is, your body will go into a vigilant state due to the, I'll speak at a technical level. I'll bring it back down to kind of terra firma. your body prioritizes or optimizes for a few things, right? Like walking and breathing primarily, not falling over being a big one. We're biped ambulatory creatures. We walk around on two legs, a very unique property of humans.
Not my kids, but yeah.
But we've optimized for that biomechanically, neurologically. And a lot of in that optimization of becoming biped is moving a lot of muscular contractions to the side of the autonomic. It's pushed over here. It's taken care of for you. So you can worry about your taxes and everything else. You don't have to consciously contract to stay upright. It's very different than quadruped animals, which is like the majority of things running around. So we're optimized for not falling over. When we start people off and with this dogma, this paradigm of like, oh, you know, body weight squats or back squats, or this is the king of this exercise, whatever. It's you're putting people in like a vigilant state where their autonomic nervous system takes over and optimizes for not falling over, right? So you're going to get a ton of compensation that you can't equate for because you're not being physically empathetic to the person who is weaker than the forces of gravity acting on them, right? Where a leg press allows you to titrate down to their level and actually provide a stimulus where they don't have to be reactive. The autonomic nervous system doesn't take over to make sure that they don't fall over under this, you know, ridiculously relatively heavy load. Right.
And what I'm hearing you say is that universally prescribed for a beginner, I am also guilty of this, is to start with body weight. And you are also saying that someone could be weaker than the gravity around them, and that body weight for that person is going to, for lack of a better term, amp up the nervous system to become hyper vigilant,
right,
kind of turned on more. And they'll compensate using potentially the incorrect movements, even on something simple like a lunge.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. And the cool thing about this, I find it cool, is visually and subjectively, it can look exactly the same. And this is where we have...
Say that again. This is very important for people.
Visually and subjectively, like if I'm looking at someone do something, like I'm a subject to them performing an exercise, and we have two people of different strength and body weight ratios. Someone can, in a vigilant state, compensate to go through a squat pattern. That's probably the easiest. And two people can do it of similar anthropometry, similar size and shape, but one be on the leading side of the relationship with gravity, strong, well-trained, and someone being new, and they be recruiting entirely different muscles, right? So it looks the same to me, but the internal state of how that movement is being performed is entirely re-strategized for the hyper-vigilant, weaker than the forces of gravity, right? And this is where to answer your original question about like, you know, how do we use biomechanics to sort of like live this long and vital and healthy and injury-free life? It's like, you need to understand that. You need to understand that, look, just because I'm looking at someone perform something next to someone else in similar, you know, shape, maybe different size, but I watch the joint angles and I go, oh, that looks like they're squatting just like this professional Olympic weightlifter or CrossFitter or whatever. If we don't understand that, like there's an engine running, a computer that's operating to optimize not for performing the movement, but for not falling over during the movement, you're going to be loading tissues that you don't equate for.
What would be an example? Give me an example.
Oh, sure. Let's go with the single leg movement we did today, right? So
embarrassing.
On the YouTube channel, we'll see a single leg hinge.
You will see what is attempted to be a single leg
right.
hinge.
But it's you know what? I think it's a really good use case for people to see, right? To all accounts, very well trained. You're in better shape than 99.9% of the population. But even you can still not understand your relationship with gravity, right? And this is where understanding the role of muscles as sensory organs comes in, right? Because you're not aware of some of these positions because you haven't trained your muscles. Like that same glute that does the clamshell, that is just primarily worried about the motor output of abducting the hip, kicking the leg off to the side, real like Jane Fonda Sunday morning special. I'm dating myself a little bit, but it's like, you know, but when the foot's on the ground, now the glute is only contracting as it feels the center of mass deviate away from the base of support. Now it's like very reactive. So we see the leg kind of like, you know, like oscillating in space, and you're trying to, like most people would say, they're trying to keep your balance. I would say that you're trying to stay stable. And what's happening with that, like really rapid, what's actually happening in the hip when your knee is kind of shaking around. People will experience this if they try like a single leg hinge. What you'll see is, you know, like, oh, my ankles are unstable or my knee. It's like, no, it's none of that, right? The foot is sitting there with a lot of sensory receptors going, where is this leg going? Because the hip isn't tuned, isn't trained with that input of the rapid stretch that would lead someone to being unstable. It's like, oh, I'm shifting a little bit this way, and then the muscle contracts, and then it overcorrects. And it's this process called neural polishing or neural sharpening, depending on your preferred nomenclature. And it's really interesting because, you know, we on the video, I'll do a rep. And I do this a lot, and I have an awareness because I do it a lot. And for me, the nice part about this type of training, this training on the end of the spectrum of integrating muscle function and polishing that reflex from like that hip that's trying to really just keep my leg over my foot, right, over my base of support, is that becomes more efficient over time. I don't have to do that as much. And I think in one of the things that I'm sure we'll get into, like warm up and prehab, is it's about doing less. It's about addition over subtraction, or addition by subtraction, right? And so to answer your question about, what is an example of two people doing an exercise that looked sort of, the exact same as we can both go through the hinge, and you're like, okay, G's foot's there, her hip joint is there, her other foot's on the ground, her hands are approximately this far from the ground, her toe on the other leg is approximately this far from the ground. If we're trying to describe a single leg RDL for those of you following along at home, and then I can get in the same position. And then I ask the $1 million question, which is, and this is where it becomes important, and this is where I think a lot of the the science may run astray, is I have to ask the question of, like, where do you feel this? Because I know muscle's a sensory organ, right? So if I'm trying to relay, or if I'm trying to understand the relationship with gravity, I need to know what muscle is, and then I can kind of reverse engineer and go, oh, okay. So for that example, when I go on one leg and I hinge, and I can do it barefoot, no heel elevation, anything like that, I feel it in my glute, right? I feel it on the side of my hip. Where you did it, and you felt it in your hamstring, right?
Everything. I always feel it in my hamstring.
And that's so telling. But to me, and it's like, we can watch you squat, and we can be like, well, this squat should be a more quad. It's like, no, it's not. You're in this vigilant state. You're fighting this ghost in the machine of gravity, and you don't realize that, yeah, your squat can look like mine, but I'm going to load more quad and more adductor, where yours, given the way that your body is interacting with gravity, is going to load more the hamstring. So it's not a hamstring strength issue that you might be having, and it might actually be a hamstring overuse, but it's not because you're overusing it from doing Nordics or hamstring curls. It's all the times you don't realize you're using it. Right. And that's where biomechanics becomes a real tool of load management. It's about equating for all of that like dark energy that you're using when you don't realize you're using it.
And this makes the idea of designing a program really challenging for someone who is not a professional at understanding, okay, well, there's a million different programs out there. How do I'm a 40-year-old person who's never trained. Where do I start? How do I do it without injuring myself and kind of progressing?